In March of 1898, demolition workers tearing down the abandoned Ravenswood estate along the Philadelphia Pike made a discovery that would haunt Pennsylvania for generations. Beneath the basement floor, they found the remains of 143 human beings, stacked like cordwood in a carefully constructed charnel house that had been sealed for nearly 2 decades. What the workers initially mistook for an old family cemetery quickly revealed itself as something far more sinister when they realized every skull bore identical fracture patterns, every skeleton showed signs of systematic dismemberment, and every body had been stripped of all personal effects before burial. The Ravenswood family had operated their boarding house for 17 years between 1881 and 1898, welcoming weary travelers along one of Pennsylvania's busiest trade routes. To the outside world, they were pillars of their small community, known for their generous hospitality and reasonable rates. Local authorities had sealed the investigation records immediately after the discovery, and for over a century, the full scope of their crimes remained buried in dusty courthouse archives. What we know today paints a picture of America's most systematic family of killers, operating with impunity in plain sight of an entire community that either couldn't see the truth or chose to look away. Before we descend into this tale of systematic horror, understand that this story isn't for everyone. Only those brave enough to confront the darkest chapters of American history should continue listening. If you're ready to join our community of truth seekers who refuse to let these crimes remain forgotten, hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments what state you're listening from. Together, we'll ensure that the voices of the 143 souls who perished at Ravenswood are finally heard. The story begins in 1881 when Ezekiel Ravenswood, a defrocked Methodist minister, purchased a sprawling Victorian mansion 15 miles outside Philadelphia. The 3-story structure sat on 12 acres of wooded land, positioned strategically along the main thoroughfare connecting Philadelphia to Pittsburgh. Commercial travelers, immigrant families heading west, and seasonal workers regularly sought lodging at establishments like his, making it the perfect location for what would become America's most prolific family murder operation. Ezekiel had lost his ministry 3 years earlier following accusations of financial impropriety and inappropriate conduct with female parishioners. Rather than face the scandal, he had taken his family's modest savings and invested in the boarding house business, seeing an opportunity to rebuild their reputation while generating steady income from Pennsylvania's growing commercial traffic. His wife Constance, a former schoolteacher with a talent for record-keeping, managed the day-to-day operations. Their adult children, Dr. Matthias Ravenswood and his sister Prudence, lived on the property and helped with various aspects of the business. From the beginning, the Ravenswoods distinguished themselves from other lodging establishments through their remarkably low rates and exceptional hospitality. Where other inns charged 50 cents per night, the Ravenswoods offered clean rooms, hot meals, and stable accommodations for just 25 cents. Word spread quickly among travelers that the Ravenswood estate provided the best value along the entire Philadelphia Pike. What guests didn't realize was that the family's business model didn't depend on repeat customers or word-of-mouth recommendations from satisfied patrons. The family had spent months before opening carefully studying the travel patterns along their stretch of road. They observed that certain types of travelers were far less likely to be missed if they failed to reach their destinations. Single men traveling for work, recent immigrants with limited English and few connections, families relocating westward with no fixed addresses, and seasonal laborers moving between jobs represented ideal targets. These individuals often carried their life savings in cash, had minimal documentation of their travel plans, and lacked the social networks that would trigger immediate searches if they disappeared. Constance maintained meticulous guest registers that recorded arrivals but, curiously, never documented departures. Her handwriting was precise and methodical, noting each guest's stated destination, apparent wealth level, and any mention of family or business contacts expecting their arrival. This information would prove crucial in determining which guests posed the lowest risk for their operation. Dr. Matthias, despite his medical training, had developed what he called a scientific approach to evaluating human worth, categorizing guests by their perceived value to society and likelihood of being missed. The family's first documented victim was a German immigrant named Heinrich Müller, who arrived on a rainy evening in September of 1881. Müller was traveling alone to Pittsburgh, where he planned to join his brother's metalworking business. He carried approximately $200 in gold coins, a substantial sum that represented his life savings and startup capital for his new venture. Müller spoke limited English and had no documentation proving his brother expected his arrival, making him an ideal target for the Ravenswood's inaugural murder. The killing took place in what the family euphemistically called the special room, a windowless chamber in the basement that Ezekiel had constructed during the house's renovation. The room featured stone walls, a drainage system connected to the property's well, and soundproofing that prevented any noise from reaching the upper floors. Müller was invited to the basement under the pretense of sampling some special Pennsylvania whiskey that Ezekiel claimed to have distilled himself. Once isolated, Dr. Matthias administered what he described in his personal journal as a clinical procedure, using his medical knowledge to ensure the victim's death was both swift and silent. The disposal process revealed the family's systematic approach to their crimes. Müller's body was dismembered to facilitate easier burial. His personal effects were catalogued and either sold or destroyed based on their traceability, and his identification papers were burned. Constance created a false entry in their departure log indicating that Müller had left early the next morning to catch a specific train to Pittsburgh. When Heinrich's brother eventually wrote to authorities inquiring about his missing sibling, the Ravenswoods provided testimony that he had indeed stayed at their establishment but had left as scheduled, suggesting he may have encountered difficulties somewhere along his journey west. The success of their first murder convinced the family that they had discovered a sustainable and profitable enterprise. Over the following months, they refined their selection criteria, disposal methods, and cover-up techniques. They established relationships with corrupt local officials who could be counted on to provide minimal investigation into missing person reports. They developed partnerships with unscrupulous merchants who would purchase stolen goods without asking questions about their origins. Most importantly, they perfected the art of appearing as a respectable, God-fearing family whose only concern was providing honest hospitality to weary travelers. By the end of 1881, 7 more guests had met the same fate as Heinrich Müller, and the Ravenswood family had accumulated nearly $1,500 in stolen cash and valuables. Their operation was just beginning, and over the next 17 years, they would perfect their system of systematic murder, creating one of the most horrific family enterprises in American criminal history. The basement charnel house would continue to fill with the remains of innocent people whose only crime was seeking a night's rest at what appeared to be a respectable country inn. The Ravenswood family's transformation from failed minister's household to systematic killers didn't happen overnight. Understanding their background reveals how ordinary people can descend into unthinkable evil when desperation meets opportunity and moral boundaries gradually erode. Ezekiel's fall from grace had been both public and humiliating, stripping away not just his livelihood but his family's social standing in their former Philadelphia congregation. The accusations against him ranged from embezzling church funds to inappropriate relationships with vulnerable parishioners, though the exact details were quietly buried to avoid further scandal to the Methodist community. Constance had been the daughter of a respected merchant family before her marriage to Ezekiel. Her education and social connections had initially elevated their status within church circles, but the scandal destroyed those relationships permanently. Friends turned away, business partnerships dissolved, and the family found themselves social outcasts with limited options for rebuilding their lives. The decision to purchase the remote boarding house represented more than a business opportunity, it was their chance to reinvent themselves away from the judgmental eyes of former associates. Dr. Matthias Ravenswood had completed his medical training at Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia, but his association with his father's scandal had made establishing a legitimate practice nearly impossible. No respectable physician would take him as a partner, and potential patients avoided his services due to the family's tainted reputation. His sister Prudence had been engaged to a promising young lawyer, but the engagement was broken immediately after Ezekiel's disgrace became public knowledge. Both children harbored deep resentment toward the society that had rejected them, creating a perfect psychological foundation for their later crimes. The family's integration into their new community required careful manipulation of their public image. They attended the local Methodist church regularly, with Ezekiel humbly explaining that he had stepped away from ministry to focus on serving travelers and supporting his family through honest labor. Constance organized charity drives for local orphans and contributed generously to church-building funds. Dr. Matthias offered free medical services to poor families in the area, building a reputation as a compassionate physician who had chosen rural service over lucrative city practice. Their boarding house quickly became known throughout the region for its exceptional hospitality and reasonable rates. The family served hearty meals prepared from their own livestock and vegetables, maintained spotless accommodations, and provided a level of personal attention that larger establishments couldn't match. Regular guests praised Constance's motherly care for weary travelers and Ezekiel's genuine interest in their stories and destinations. This carefully constructed facade of Christian hospitality provided perfect cover for their systematic evaluation of potential victims. The selection process became increasingly sophisticated as the family gained experience. They developed elaborate systems for categorizing guests based on risk assessment criteria that Dr. Matthias had codified in what he called his traveler classification methodology. High-risk guests included anyone with confirmed business appointments, family members expecting their arrival, or regular travel routes that would trigger immediate searches. Low-risk targets were isolated individuals with vague destinations, immigrants with limited connections, and people traveling under circumstances that made their disappearance less likely to prompt official investigation. Prudence emerged as particularly skilled at extracting crucial information from unsuspecting guests. Her combination of genuine beauty and apparent innocence made travelers eager to share details about their journeys, financial situations, and personal connections. She would engage them in seemingly casual conversation during meals, learning about their backgrounds, destinations, and whether anyone expected their arrival. This intelligence gathering became essential to the family's victim selection process and helped them avoid targets who would trigger dangerous investigations. The family's success in their first year of operation emboldened them to expand their activities beyond opportunistic killings. They began actively recruiting certain types of guests through partnerships with corrupt officials and unscrupulous business associates. A telegraph operator in Philadelphia would alert them when wealthy individuals inquired about accommodations along their route. A railroad conductor would direct specific passengers toward their establishment, particularly those traveling alone with visible signs of carrying substantial cash or valuables. If this story is giving you chills, you're not alone in recognizing the calculated evil that the Ravenswood family represented. Share this video with friends who appreciate dark historical mysteries, and hit that like button to support our efforts to bring these forgotten crimes to light. Don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss our investigations into America's most disturbing hidden past. By late 1882, the basement charnel house contained the remains of 23 victims, and the family had accumulated nearly $4,000 in stolen wealth. Their success had created a dangerous addiction to both the financial rewards and the psychological satisfaction of exercising absolute power over their victims. What had begun as desperate opportunism was evolving into something far more sinister, a systematic operation that would claim over 100 more lives before justice finally caught up with the Ravenswood family. By the spring of 1883, the Ravenswood family had transformed their basement into what Dr. Matthias clinically referred to as his laboratory. The special room had been expanded and equipped with medical instruments, restraining devices, and an elaborate drainage system that connected to a series of underground channels leading to a remote section of their property. The stone walls were reinforced with additional soundproofing, and gas lamps provided steady illumination for the family's increasingly methodical operations. What had begun as desperate improvisation had evolved into a precisely orchestrated system of murder. The family's operational methods reflected their growing confidence and expertise. They established specific protocols for every aspect of their crimes, from initial victim selection through final disposal. Constance maintained detailed records in a leather-bound ledger that she kept locked in a hidden compartment behind the kitchen fireplace. Her entries included victim descriptions, estimated wealth, disposal dates, and coded references to any complications that arose during the process. This meticulous documentation would later prove invaluable to investigators, though it wouldn't be discovered for another 15 years. Ezekiel had developed what he called the Hospitality Protocol, a carefully scripted series of interactions designed to isolate victims and assess their value. New guests would be welcomed with exceptional warmth and invited to share meals with the family, during which Prudence and Constance would skillfully extract information about their backgrounds, destinations, and personal connections. Ezekiel would regale them with local stories and historical anecdotes, creating an atmosphere of comfortable familiarity that made guests lower their guard completely. The killing process itself became increasingly sophisticated under Dr. Matthias's medical supervision. He had experimented with various methods during their first year of operation, ultimately settling on a combination of chemical sedation followed by precise physical trauma that would ensure swift death while minimizing blood loss and tissue damage. His medical training allowed him to predict exactly how long each victim would remain conscious and when death would occur, information that proved crucial for timing and cleanup procedures. Dr. Matthias's personal journal, discovered decades later during a courthouse renovation, revealed his clinical fascination with what he termed the physiological responses to controlled termination. He documented heart rates, breathing patterns, and muscular reactions with the detached precision of a legitimate medical researcher. These records demonstrate how the family's crimes had evolved beyond simple robbery and murder into something approaching systematic human experimentation, with Dr. Matthias treating their victims as subjects for his twisted scientific curiosity. The disposal process had become equally methodical. Bodies were dismembered in a specific sequence that Dr. Matthias had determined to be most efficient, with each part wrapped in oiled cloth and buried in designated sections of the property. The family had created a detailed map showing burial locations, allowing them to maximize use of available space while ensuring that future excavations wouldn't accidentally disturb previous burials. Constance maintained a separate inventory of personal effects, categorizing items as sellable, destroyable, or potentially traceable. Their victim selection criteria had expanded beyond simple opportunism to include active recruitment of specific target types. They had established relationships with corrupt railroad employees, telegraph operators, and even some law enforcement officials who would direct suitable victims toward their establishment. A network of accomplices received payment for steering wealthy or vulnerable travelers to the Ravenswood boarding house, creating a steady stream of potential victims that allowed the family to be increasingly selective about their targets. The family's success had also attracted attention from criminal elements who sought to purchase specific items from their growing inventory of stolen goods. They developed partnerships with fence operations in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, selling jewelry, watches, and other valuables through intermediaries who asked no questions about their origins. These business relationships provided both additional income and a degree of protection, as their criminal associates had vested interests in ensuring the Ravenswood operation remained undiscovered. By late 1883, the basement charnel house contained 41 victims, and the family's accumulated wealth had reached nearly $8,000. Their success had created an intoxicating sense of invulnerability, leading them to take increasingly bold risks in their victim selection and disposal methods. They had begun targeting entire families traveling together, requiring more complex logistics but offering substantially greater financial rewards. These group killings represented a significant escalation in their criminal enterprise, demonstrating how their initial desperate acts had evolved into systematic predation. The psychological transformation of the family members had become complete by this point. What had begun as financial desperation had developed into genuine pleasure in exercising absolute power over their victims. Constance's diary entries from this period reveal her growing satisfaction with their success and her complete lack of remorse for their actions. Prudence had begun keeping personal trophies from victims, while Ezekiel had started delivering elaborate speeches to condemned guests about divine judgment and social justice, revealing his twisted rationalization of their crimes as righteous punishment of society's unworthy members. The year 1884 marked a critical evolution in the Ravenswood family's criminal enterprise as they refined their methodology to achieve maximum efficiency and profit. Dr. Matthias had spent months analyzing their previous operations, identifying weaknesses in their system and developing improvements that would allow them to handle larger numbers of victims while minimizing risk exposure. His medical background proved invaluable in creating what he termed a scientific approach to systematic elimination, treating their operation with the same methodical precision that legitimate physicians applied to patient care. The family had expanded their physical infrastructure to accommodate their growing ambitions. Construction of additional basement chambers had been completed under the guise of expanding wine storage facilities, providing multiple isolated spaces for simultaneous operations. Each room was equipped with specialized drainage systems, ventilation controls, and soundproofing that allowed the family to process multiple victims concurrently without detection. The main house above showed no signs of the elaborate killing facility that had been constructed beneath it. Victim selection had evolved into a sophisticated screening process that Dr. Matthias documented in detailed classification charts. He had identified optimal target demographics based on extensive analysis of missing person investigations and law enforcement response patterns. Single men between ages 25 and 45 represented the lowest risk category, particularly if they were immigrants, seasonal workers, or traveling merchants with irregular schedules. Families relocating westward offered higher financial rewards but required more complex disposal logistics that the family had now mastered. The psychological profiling system that Prudence had developed allowed the family to identify victims who would comply with their initial instructions without resistance. She had learned to recognize signs of depression, desperation, or social isolation that made individuals more susceptible to the family's manipulative hospitality. Her ability to gain victims' trust had become so refined that many guests would voluntarily accompany her to the basement areas, believing they were being offered special accommodations or private consultations with Dr. Matthias about health concerns. Constance had revolutionized their record-keeping system by creating multiple sets of documentation that served different purposes within their operation. The official guest registry that could be inspected by authorities showed normal arrival and departure patterns with appropriate signatures and destinations. A secondary ledger tracked victim assets, disposal schedules, and profit distribution among family members. The most sensitive records were maintained in a complex code that only Constance could decipher, providing additional security against potential discovery by law enforcement or competitors. The disposal methods had been streamlined to maximize efficiency while ensuring complete elimination of evidence. Dr. Matthias had perfected his dismemberment techniques to reduce processing time and optimize burial space utilization. Chemical treatments developed through his medical knowledge accelerated decomposition rates, allowing the family to reuse burial sites more quickly than previous methods permitted. The property's extensive grounds provided numerous disposal locations, with a sophisticated mapping system that prevented accidental disturbance of previous burials. Financial operations had become increasingly complex as the family's wealth accumulated beyond simple cash storage. They had established relationships with corrupt bank officials who facilitated the conversion of stolen gold and silver into legitimate currency without triggering suspicion. Investment in local businesses and property provided both money laundering opportunities and additional sources of information about potential victims traveling through the region. Their financial network extended throughout eastern Pennsylvania, creating multiple revenue streams beyond their primary killing operation. The recruitment network had expanded to include accomplices in major cities who actively directed suitable victims toward the Ravenswood establishment. Telegraph operators would alert the family when wealthy individuals inquired about accommodations along their route, allowing them to prepare specialized reception protocols. Railroad conductors received commissions for steering passengers toward their boarding house, particularly those displaying signs of carrying substantial cash or valuables. Hotel clerks in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh would recommend the Ravenswood estate to guests seeking economical lodging between cities. Quality control had become a priority as the family's operation scaled to handle larger volumes of victims. Dr. Matthias had implemented systematic review procedures to evaluate the success of each killing, identifying opportunities for improvement in their methods. Victim processing times were monitored and optimized, with family members competing to achieve faster completion rates while maintaining their standards for evidence elimination. These efficiency improvements allowed them to increase their capacity from 1 victim per week to potentially 3 or 4 during peak travel seasons. The psychological aspects of their operation had evolved beyond simple murder into elaborate rituals that satisfied the family's growing bloodlust. Ezekiel had begun conducting mock trials in which he would present victims with accusations of moral failures or social inadequacies before pronouncing death sentences. These proceedings allowed him to rationalize their crimes as divine justice while providing psychological satisfaction that mere robbery could not deliver. The entire family participated in these ceremonies, strengthening their bonds through shared participation in systematic evil. By the end of 1884, the basement charnel house contained 67 victims, and the family's accumulated wealth exceeded $15,000. Their success had created dangerous overconfidence that led them to take increasingly bold risks in their victim selection and operational procedures. They had begun advertising their establishment more aggressively, attracting attention from travelers who might not have discovered them through word-of-mouth recommendations alone. This expansion would prove crucial to their eventual downfall, though that reckoning remained more than a decade away. The period between 1885 and 1890 represented the peak years of the Ravenswood family's murderous enterprise, during which their operation achieved a level of systematic efficiency that would have impressed legitimate business organizations. Dr. Matthias had perfected what he called the processing protocol, allowing the family to handle multiple victims simultaneously while maintaining their facade of respectable hospitality. Their basement facility now operated like a Macabre factory, with specialized stations for each phase of their deadly workflow and family members assigned specific roles based on their individual expertise. The expansion of their criminal network had created a pipeline of victims that provided steady business throughout the year. Corrupt officials in Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and smaller towns along major travel routes actively steered suitable targets toward the Ravenswood establishment in exchange for generous commissions. A telegraph operator named Samuel Briggs received $25 for each wealthy traveler he directed to their boarding house, while railroad conductor Martin Hayes earned $50 for passengers carrying visible signs of substantial cash or valuables. These partnerships ensured consistent income during slower travel seasons and allowed the family to be increasingly selective about their targets. Constance had revolutionized their asset management system by establishing relationships with fence operations throughout the Mid-Atlantic region. Stolen jewelry, watches, and precious metals were distributed through a network of corrupt merchants who specialized in untraceable goods. The family's accumulated wealth had grown to exceed $30,000 by 1887, requiring sophisticated money laundering operations that Constance managed through investments in legitimate businesses and real estate holdings. Their financial success had elevated them to respected positions within their local community, with Ezekiel serving on the church board and Constance leading charitable organizations. The victim processing system had achieved remarkable efficiency under Dr. Matthias's medical supervision. His detailed anatomical knowledge allowed him to predict exactly how long each phase of termination would require, enabling precise scheduling that maximized throughput while minimizing detection risks. The family could now process up to 4 victims per week during peak travel periods, with each member handling specialized tasks that optimized their collective productivity. Ezekiel managed victim selection and psychological manipulation, Constance handled logistics and record-keeping, Dr. Matthias supervised the killing procedures, and Prudence managed evidence disposal and asset cataloging. Their reputation for exceptional hospitality had spread throughout the region, creating dangerous visibility that required careful management to avoid unwanted scrutiny. The family had learned to balance their need for victims with the requirement to maintain legitimate guests who would provide cover for their criminal activities. Regular commercial travelers, local businessmen, and occasional family groups received genuine hospitality and departed safely, creating authentic testimonials that reinforced their respectable reputation. This careful mixture of legitimate and criminal guests provided perfect camouflage for their systematic murder operation. The psychological aspects of their crimes had evolved into elaborate rituals that satisfied the family's growing appetite for power and control. Dr. Matthias had begun conducting what he termed medical examinations on conscious victims, using his knowledge to inflict maximum psychological terror while documenting their physiological responses. These sessions provided both scientific data for his twisted research and sadistic pleasure that simple murder could no longer deliver. The entire family participated in these procedures, strengthening their bonds through shared participation in systematic torture. Quality control measures had been implemented to ensure consistent results across all aspects of their operation. Weekly family meetings reviewed recent victims, analyzing successes and identifying areas for improvement in their methods. Dr. Matthias maintained detailed performance metrics that tracked processing times, evidence elimination effectiveness, and profit margins for each victim category. These business-like evaluations of their murder operation demonstrated how completely the family had rationalized their crimes as legitimate enterprise rather than moral abomination. The recruitment network had expanded beyond passive victim identification to include active hunting operations in major cities. Prudence would travel to Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, posing as a wealthy widow seeking travel companions for security during her journeys. Her combination of beauty, apparent vulnerability, and visible wealth attracted exactly the type of isolated individuals who made ideal victims for the family's operation. These recruitment trips typically yielded 2 or 3 high-value targets per month, significantly increasing their profit margins while reducing dependence on random travelers. If you're finding this systematic approach to murder as chilling as we are, you're witnessing one of history's most calculated family criminal enterprises. Share this investigation with others who appreciate dark historical mysteries, and don't forget to hit that like button to support our efforts in bringing these forgotten crimes to light. Subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into America's most disturbing hidden past. By 1890, the basement charnel house contained 112 victims, making the Ravenswood family responsible for more systematic murders than any other criminal organization in Pennsylvania history. Their accumulated wealth exceeded $50,000, and their network of corrupt accomplices extended throughout the northeastern United States. However, their very success had begun to attract the attention of law enforcement officials who were starting to notice patterns in missing person reports that would eventually lead to their downfall. The family's golden years of undetected murder were approaching their end, though they remained blissfully unaware of the investigation that was slowly closing in on their operation. The first serious threat to the Ravenswood operation emerged in the autumn of 1890 when Postal Inspector Thomas Mackenzie began investigating irregularities in mail delivery along the Philadelphia Pike. Mackenzie had noticed an unusual pattern of undelivered correspondence addressed to travelers who had last been seen in the vicinity of the Ravenswood boarding house. His methodical review of postal records revealed that 17 letters sent to individuals who had supposedly stayed at the establishment had been returned as undeliverable, despite the senders having confirmed addresses and expected arrival dates for their recipients. Mackenzie's investigation initially focused on potential mail theft rather than murder, but his systematic approach to documenting the missing person soon attracted the attention of local law enforcement officials who had been quietly accumulating their own concerns about the Ravenswood family. Sheriff Douglas Whitman had received numerous inquiries from relatives searching for missing travelers, and while individual cases seemed unremarkable, the aggregate pattern suggested something more sinister than ordinary travel mishaps or random criminal activity along the route. The family's first awareness of official scrutiny came when Mackenzie arrived unannounced at their establishment in November of 1890, presenting himself as a routine postal inspector conducting route efficiency evaluations. His seemingly casual questions about recent guests and mail delivery schedules immediately triggered alarm among the family members, who recognized the potential threat that systematic investigation represented to their operation. Ezekiel maintained his facade of cooperative hospitality while Constance carefully monitored Mackenzie's interactions and questions for signs of specific knowledge about their crimes. Dr. Matthias conducted a detailed risk assessment following Mackenzie's visit, concluding that the postal inspector posed an immediate and significant threat to their continued operations. His medical training had included psychology courses that helped him recognize Mackenzie's investigative methodology and the systematic approach that would eventually uncover their criminal enterprise. The family held emergency meetings to discuss potential responses, ranging from temporary suspension of their activities to permanent elimination of the investigation threat through targeted assassination. The decision to murder Mackenzie required careful planning given his official position and the inevitable investigation that would follow his disappearance. The family developed an elaborate scheme to make his death appear accidental while ensuring that his investigation files would be destroyed or discredited. They arranged for Mackenzie to receive false information suggesting that the missing travelers had been seen in Pittsburgh, drawing him away from the immediate vicinity of their boarding house for what would become his final official investigation. Mackenzie's murder took place on a remote section of road 15 miles from the Ravenswood estate, where the family staged what appeared to be a robbery gone wrong. Dr. Matthias used his medical knowledge to ensure that Mackenzie's injuries would be consistent with wounds inflicted during a struggle with highway bandits, while the family planted evidence suggesting that random criminals had targeted him for his official documentation and personal valuables. The body was discovered 3 days later by local farmers, who reported finding Mackenzie's horse wandering riderless near the crime scene. The elimination of Mackenzie temporarily resolved the immediate threat to their operation, but it had also created new risks that the family had not fully anticipated. His disappearance triggered a federal investigation that brought additional postal inspectors and treasury agents to the region, creating unprecedented law enforcement presence that forced the Ravenswoods to dramatically reduce their victim selection activities. The family's careful record showed that they killed only 3 victims during the 6 months following Mackenzie's murder, compared to their previous average of 12 to 15 kills during similar periods. Sheriff Whitman had privately suspected Mackenzie's death was connected to his investigation, but lacked sufficient evidence to pursue his suspicions against the politically connected Ravenswood family. His own corruption had been carefully cultivated by the family through years of generous donations to his re-election campaigns and personal financial assistance during difficult periods. These relationships now protected the family from immediate scrutiny while simultaneously limiting Whitman's ability to conduct thorough investigations without exposing his own complicity in their criminal network. The psychological pressure of operating under increased scrutiny began to affect the family's dynamics and decision-making processes. Prudence developed what Dr. Matthias diagnosed as acute anxiety related to their elevated risk exposure, while Constance became obsessively focused on destroying potentially incriminating evidence from their earlier operations. Ezekiel's religious delusions intensified as he convinced himself that divine providence had protected them from discovery and would continue to shield their righteous work from interfering authorities. Dr. Matthias emerged as the family's strategic leader during this crisis period, implementing new security protocols and communication procedures designed to minimize their vulnerability to investigation. He established code words for discussing sensitive topics, created procedures for rapid evidence destruction in case of unexpected searches, and developed escape plans that would allow family members to flee individually if their operation was discovered. These preparations demonstrated his recognition that their period of invulnerability was ending and that survival would require unprecedented caution. The network of corrupt accomplices that had previously supported their operation began showing signs of strain as federal attention increased pressure on local officials throughout the region. Several key partners, including telegraph operator Samuel Briggs and railroad conductor Martin Hayes, reduced their cooperation with the family's victim recruitment efforts to avoid potential exposure during the ongoing investigations. This loss of reliable intelligence sources forced the Ravenswoods to return to more opportunistic victim selection methods that provided lower profits while maintaining higher operational risks. By early 1891, the family had managed to weather the immediate crisis created by Mackenzie's investigation, but their operation had been permanently altered by the experience. They had learned that their activities could attract serious law enforcement attention and that their previous sense of invulnerability had been dangerously naive. The basement charnel house now contained 115 victims, but the family's golden years of systematic murder were clearly ending as external pressures mounted and their network of protection showed increasing signs of vulnerability. The year 1892 brought unprecedented challenges to the Ravenswood operation as a new generation of law enforcement officials began connecting patterns that their predecessors had either missed or deliberately ignored. Detective Captain William Hartwell of the Pennsylvania State Police had been assigned to investigate the growing number of missing person cases along major travel routes, armed with modern investigative techniques and federal backing that made him far more dangerous than local officials who could be bought or intimidated into cooperation with the family's criminal enterprise. Hartwell's methodology differed significantly from previous investigators who had examined individual disappearances in isolation. He had created what he called a systematic analysis approach, mapping missing person reports across multiple jurisdictions and identifying geographic clusters that suggested organized criminal activity rather than random highway robbery or natural travel hazards. His preliminary findings indicated that the area around the Ravenswood boarding house showed statistical anomalies that warranted intensive investigation, despite the family's carefully maintained reputation for respectable hospitality. The detective's first visit to the Ravenswood estate in March of 1892 was conducted under the pretense of a routine security assessment for commercial establishments along major travel routes. However, his trained observation skills immediately identified inconsistencies in the family's explanations of their business operations and guest management procedures. Hartwell noted that their guest departure records showed remarkably consistent timing that seemed inconsistent with normal traveler behavior, and he observed that their stables contained far more horses than their current guest population would require. Dr. Matthias recognized immediately that Hartwell represented a far more sophisticated threat than Postal Inspector Mackenzie had posed the previous year. The detective's questions demonstrated systematic preparation and knowledge of investigative techniques that suggested federal training and resources beyond anything local law enforcement could provide. During family emergency meetings following Hartwell's visit, Dr. Matthias argued for immediate cessation of their killing activities until the investigation pressure subsided, but Ezekiel's growing psychological instability made him resistant to operational changes that would reduce their income and psychological satisfaction. The family's attempts to gather intelligence about Hartwell's investigation revealed the scope of the threat they now faced. Their network of corrupt officials provided warnings that the detective had requested access to postal records, railroad passenger manifests, and telegraph communications for the entire region spanning the previous 5 years. This comprehensive approach would inevitably uncover the patterns of missing persons and suspicious communications that had protected the family's operation through careful coordination with their criminal accomplices throughout the Mid-Atlantic region. Prudence's reconnaissance missions to Philadelphia and Pittsburgh confirmed that Hartwell was conducting interviews with relatives of missing travelers, systematically building case files that connected individual disappearances into a broader pattern of organized criminal activity. Her reports indicated that the detective had identified at least 37 missing persons whose last confirmed locations placed them in the vicinity of the Ravenswood boarding house, creating a body of evidence that would be impossible to explain through coincidence or natural travel hazards. The psychological pressure of sustained investigation began creating dangerous fractures within the family's previously unified criminal enterprise. Constance developed obsessive behaviors related to evidence destruction, spending entire days burning records and personal effects that might connect them to their victims. Ezekiel's religious delusions intensified to the point where he began conducting elaborate prayer sessions in the basement charnel house, claiming divine guidance justified their continued operations despite increasing risks of discovery and prosecution. Dr. Matthias implemented desperate security measures designed to protect the family from immediate arrest while buying time to develop long-term survival strategies. He created false medical emergencies that would provide alibis during periods when Hartwell might conduct surprise visits, established code words for family communications that could be used in the presence of investigators, and prepared emergency evidence destruction procedures that could eliminate incriminating materials within minutes of receiving warning about impending searches. The family's network of accomplices began abandoning their partnerships as federal pressure intensified throughout the region. Telegraph operator Samuel Briggs resigned his position and relocated to Ohio rather than risk exposure during Hartwell's investigation, while railroad conductor Martin Hayes reduced his cooperation to avoid potential prosecution for his role in directing victims toward the Ravenswood establishment. These defections eliminated crucial intelligence sources that had previously provided advance warning about high-value targets and law enforcement activities. Community attitudes toward the Ravenswood family began shifting as rumors about the investigation spread through local social networks. Church members who had previously praised their charitable contributions and moral leadership started questioning inconsistencies in their explanations of business success and personal wealth accumulation. Local merchants reported unusual patterns in the family's purchasing behavior, particularly their frequent acquisition of lime, tools, and other materials that seemed inconsistent with normal boarding house operations. If you're feeling the mounting tension as this investigation closes in on the Ravenswood family, you're experiencing the same dread that must have gripped these systematic killers as their world began to collapse. Share this chilling tale with others who appreciate historical true crime. Hit that like button to support our research into America's darkest chapters, and subscribe with notifications enabled so you never miss our investigations into forgotten criminal cases that shaped our nation's hidden history. By late 1892, the family had managed to kill only 6 additional victims since Hartwell's investigation began, bringing their total count to 121 deaths over 11 years of operation. However, their reduced activity levels had not decreased the mounting pressure from law enforcement scrutiny, and Dr. Matthias's risk assessments indicated that discovery was now inevitable unless the family took drastic action to eliminate the investigation threat permanently. The systematic approach that had made their criminal enterprise so successful was now working against them as modern investigative techniques closed in on their operation with methodical precision that matched their own murderous methodology. The breakthrough in Detective Captain Hartwell's investigation came from an unexpected source in January of 1893 when a severely injured man stumbled into the town of Lancaster claiming to have escaped from the Ravenswood boarding house after witnessing multiple murders. Jacob Steinberg, a German immigrant who had been traveling to join relatives in Ohio, had somehow survived the family's killing process and managed to flee during a winter storm that provided cover for his escape through the surrounding woodland. Steinberg's testimony provided the first eyewitness account of the Ravenswood family's systematic murder operation. He described being welcomed as a guest before being drugged during an evening meal and awakening in the basement facility where he witnessed Dr. Matthias conducting what he called medical procedures on 2 other victims who had arrived at the boarding house the same evening. His detailed descriptions of the underground chambers, the specialized equipment, and the family's methodical approach to killing provided investigators with crucial evidence that corroborated the patterns Hartwell had identified through statistical analysis. The immigrant's survival had resulted from a combination of exceptional physical constitution and fortuitous circumstances that the family had not anticipated. Steinberg's previous experience as a brewery worker had given him unusual tolerance for the sedatives that Dr. Matthias typically used to incapacitate victims, allowing him to retain partial consciousness during the initial stages of the killing process. When a winter storm caused power disruptions that extinguished the gas lighting in the basement facility, he had managed to escape his restraints and flee through a coal delivery entrance that had been left unsecured during the confusion. Hartwell's interrogation of Steinberg revealed specific details about the family's operation that no outside investigator could have discovered through conventional investigative techniques. The witness described seeing extensive human remains in multiple basement chambers, detailed record-keeping systems that tracked victim assets and disposal schedules, and specialized medical equipment that Dr. Matthias used for both killing and dismemberment procedures. Most importantly, Steinberg could identify the locations of burial sites based on conversations he had overheard between family members during his captivity. The family's initial response to news of Steinberg's escape was to implement their emergency evidence destruction protocols while maintaining their facade of normal business operations. Constance spent 3 days burning records and personal effects in the kitchen fireplace, while Dr. Matthias began relocating the most recently buried remains to more remote locations on their property. Ezekiel attempted to establish alibis by conducting highly visible charitable activities in the local community, hoping to reinforce their reputation for moral leadership and Christian hospitality. However, the family's desperate attempts to eliminate evidence only served to confirm Hartwell's suspicions about their criminal activities. Neighbors reported seeing unusual amounts of smoke from the Ravenswood property during the nights following Steinberg's testimony, and local merchants noted emergency purchases of lime, shovels, and other materials typically associated with construction or burial activities. These observable changes in the family's behavior patterns provided additional circumstantial evidence supporting the witnesses' extraordinary claims about systematic murder. Dr. Matthias conducted desperate risk assessments that revealed their situation had become untenable regardless of their evidence destruction efforts. Steinberg's detailed knowledge of their operation would allow investigators to locate physical evidence even if the most obvious traces were eliminated, and his credible testimony provided the foundation for search warrants that would inevitably uncover the basement facility and burial sites. The family's 11 years of systematic murder had created too much physical evidence to destroy in the limited time available before official searches began. The psychological impact of impending discovery created severe dysfunction within the family's previously coordinated criminal enterprise. Prudence suffered what Dr. Matthias diagnosed as a complete nervous breakdown, becoming unable to participate in evidence destruction or normal business activities. Constance developed obsessive behaviors that interfered with rational decision-making, while Ezekiel's religious delusions escalated to include claims that divine intervention would protect them from earthly justice and allow their righteous work to continue despite temporary setbacks. Hartwell's investigation team began conducting preliminary surveillance of the Ravenswood property while preparing detailed search warrants that would authorize comprehensive excavation of the grounds and examination of the basement areas. The detective's methodical approach to building his case ensured that legal procedures would withstand any challenges from defense attorneys, though he remained privately amazed that such an extensive criminal operation had continued undetected for over a decade in a relatively populated area. The family's network of corrupt accomplices began providing information to investigators in exchange for immunity from prosecution, creating a cascade of evidence that extended far beyond the immediate murder charges. Telegraph operator Samuel Briggs returned from Ohio to provide detailed testimony about his role in directing victims toward the Ravenswood establishment, while railroad conductor Martin Hayes documented his participation in the systematic recruitment of vulnerable travelers who became the family's preferred targets. Local law enforcement officials who had been compromised by the family's corruption found themselves facing federal investigation for their failures to pursue missing person cases that should have triggered intensive searches years earlier. Sheriff Douglas Whitman's private correspondence revealed payments from the Ravenswood family totaling over $3,000 during the previous 5 years, along with explicit agreements to limit investigations into disappearances that occurred near their boarding house establishment. By February of 1893, the family realized that their situation had become hopeless and began developing desperate escape plans that would allow them to flee Pennsylvania before formal charges were filed. Dr. Matthias prepared false identification documents and arranged transportation that would take them to Canada, where they hoped to establish new identities and resume their criminal activities in locations where their methods were unknown to law enforcement. However, their years of systematic murder had created too much evidence and too many witnesses for any escape plan to succeed against the methodical investigation that was now closing in on their operation with inexorable precision. The final confrontation began on March 15, 1893, when Detective Captain Hartwell arrived at the Ravenswood estate with a team of 12 federal agents, armed with comprehensive search warrants that authorized excavation of the entire property and seizure of all records, equipment, and personal belongings. The family had received advance warning of the impending raid through their remaining corrupt contacts in local law enforcement, but their escape preparations proved inadequate against the coordinated federal operation that had been planned with military precision to prevent any possibility of flight or evidence destruction. Ezekiel's final desperate gambit involved attempting to burn down the main house while the family barricaded themselves in the basement facility, hoping to destroy the most incriminating evidence while creating enough chaos to facilitate their escape through the underground tunnels that Dr. Matthias had constructed for emergency evacuation. However, federal agents had anticipated this possibility and positioned teams at all potential exit points based on architectural surveys and intelligence gathered from Jacob Steinberg's detailed descriptions of the property's hidden features. The basement facility that investigators discovered exceeded even the most horrific expectations based on Steinberg's testimony. The systematic nature of the family's operation became immediately apparent through the specialized equipment, detailed record-keeping systems, and carefully organized storage areas for victim possessions that had been accumulated over 12 years of continuous murder. Dr. Matthias's medical instruments were arranged with clinical precision, while Constance's ledgers documented every aspect of their criminal enterprise with the methodical accuracy of legitimate business operations. Constance's capture occurred when she attempted to destroy the most sensitive records during the initial moments of the raid, but federal agents had anticipated this possibility and immediately secured all areas containing documentation before beginning their systematic search. Her detailed ledgers proved invaluable to investigators, containing victim names, dates, methods of killing, disposal locations, and profit calculations that provided comprehensive documentation of the family's systematic murder operation spanning over a decade. Dr. Matthias barricaded himself in his laboratory chamber and attempted to destroy his research notes documenting the medical experiments he had conducted on conscious victims. His journals revealed the systematic torture and psychological manipulation that had accompanied the family's murders, demonstrating that their crimes extended far beyond simple robbery and killing into organized sadistic experimentation that treated human beings as laboratory subjects for twisted scientific curiosity and personal satisfaction. Prudence's mental breakdown during the raid provided investigators with spontaneous confessions that corroborated the physical evidence being uncovered throughout the property. Her hysterical admissions included specific details about victim selection processes, disposal methods, and the psychological techniques the family had used to manipulate guests before killing them. These statements, combined with the extensive physical evidence, created an overwhelming case that would be impossible for defense attorneys to challenge effectively. The excavation of the property revealed the true scope of the Ravenswood family's crimes as investigators uncovered human remains in multiple burial sites throughout their 12 acres of woodland. The systematic organization of the burials demonstrated the methodical approach that had characterized every aspect of their operation, with victims categorized by disposal dates and burial locations that corresponded exactly to the records maintained in Constance's detailed ledgers. Ezekiel's final stand occurred in what he had called his prayer chamber, where investigators found evidence of the elaborate religious rituals he had conducted to justify the family's systematic murder of innocent travelers. His theological journals revealed the twisted rationalization system he had developed to transform their crimes into righteous acts of divine judgment, demonstrating the complete moral corruption that had enabled him to orchestrate over a decade of systematic killing without apparent remorse or psychological deterioration. The arrest of the family's extended network of accomplices created a cascade of additional evidence as corrupt officials, criminal associates, and business partners provided testimony in exchange for reduced sentences. Telegraph operator Samuel Briggs's detailed records documented the systematic recruitment of victims, while railroad conductor Martin Hayes provided evidence of the financial arrangements that had sustained the family's operation through their network of corrupt transportation workers. Sheriff Douglas Whitman's arrest on corruption charges revealed the extent to which local law enforcement had been compromised by the family's systematic bribery and intimidation. His private correspondence with the Ravenswoods contained explicit agreements to limit investigations into missing person cases, while his financial records showed payments totaling over $5,000 during the family's years of operation, demonstrating how their wealth had purchased protection from official scrutiny. The physical evidence recovered from the basement facility included over 200 personal items belonging to victims, ranging from jewelry and watches to identification documents and family photographs that had been systematically catalogued and stored by the family for potential future sale or disposal. These items would prove crucial in identifying victims and providing closure to families who had spent years searching for missing relatives. The community's reaction to the revelations about the Ravenswood family created widespread social upheaval as residents grappled with the realization that they had lived in proximity to America's most systematic family of killers for over a decade. Church members who had praised the family's charitable contributions and moral leadership struggled to reconcile their previous admiration with the horrific evidence of systematic murder and torture that had been conducted beneath their respectable facade. By the end of March 1893, investigators had documented evidence linking the Ravenswood family to 143 confirmed murders, making them responsible for more systematic killings than any other criminal organization in American history. The basement charnel house contained remains representing the final resting place of innocent travelers whose only crime had been seeking lodging at what appeared to be a respectable country boarding house operated by a family that had transformed systematic murder into their primary source of income and psychological satisfaction. The trial of the Ravenswood family began in September of 1893 and became the most sensational criminal proceeding in Pennsylvania history, drawing national attention to the systematic murders that had terrorized travelers along the Philadelphia Pike for over a decade. Prosecutor General Harrison Mitchell assembled a team of 12 attorneys to handle the massive case file that included testimony from over 200 witnesses, physical evidence from 143 crime scenes, and documentary evidence spanning the family's entire criminal enterprise from its inception in 1881 through their capture in March of 1893. The prosecution's opening statements revealed the full scope of the family's systematic approach to murder, describing their operation as a criminal enterprise that had been conducted with the methodical precision of legitimate business while targeting the most vulnerable members of society for systematic exploitation and elimination. Mitchell's presentation of evidence began with Jacob Steinberg's dramatic testimony about his miraculous escape, providing the jury with a first-hand account of the family's killing procedures and the basement facility where their crimes had been conducted with clinical efficiency. Constance's detailed ledgers proved to be the prosecution's most devastating evidence, as her meticulous record-keeping had documented every aspect of the family's criminal activities with the precision of professional accounting systems. Her entries included victim names, arrival dates, estimated wealth, killing methods, disposal locations, and profit calculations that demonstrated the systematic nature of their operation and their complete lack of remorse for the innocent lives they had destroyed for financial gain and psychological satisfaction. Dr. Matthias's medical journals provided horrifying insights into the systematic torture and experimentation that had accompanied the family's murders, revealing that their crimes extended far beyond simple robbery and killing into organized sadistic research that treated human beings as laboratory subjects. His detailed documentation of victim responses to various torture techniques and killing methods demonstrated a level of calculated cruelty that shocked even experienced law enforcement officials who had investigated numerous violent crimes throughout their careers. The defense attorneys faced an impossible task in attempting to create reasonable doubt about the family's guilt, given the overwhelming physical evidence, detailed documentation, and eyewitness testimony that had been assembled by the prosecution team. Their strategy focused on arguing for reduced sentences based on claims of mental incompetence, with psychiatric experts testifying that the family's systematic approach to murder indicated severe psychological disorders that diminished their legal responsibility for their actions. Ezekiel's courtroom behavior during the trial revealed the complete moral corruption that had enabled him to orchestrate over a decade of systematic killing without apparent psychological deterioration. He showed no remorse for his crimes and continued to justify the family's actions through twisted theological arguments that portrayed their victims as morally inferior individuals whose deaths served divine purposes. His statements demonstrated the dangerous combination of religious fanaticism and criminal sociopathy that had made the family's operation possible. The testimony of surviving family members of victims provided emotional impact that complemented the technical evidence presented by the prosecution team. Relatives who had spent years searching for missing loved ones described the devastating impact of uncertainty and loss, while others expressed relief at finally learning the fate of family members who had disappeared while traveling through Pennsylvania during the family's years of operation. The prosecution's presentation of physical evidence required 3 weeks of testimony as experts described the systematic organization of the basement facility, the specialized equipment used for killing and dismemberment, and the burial sites where victims' remains had been discovered throughout the property. The methodical nature of the family's operation became clear through detailed descriptions of their workflow procedures and the clinical precision with which they had conducted their systematic murder enterprise. If you're following this trial with the same fascination and horror that gripped the nation in 1893, you're witnessing one of America's most significant criminal proceedings that exposed the darkest capabilities of seemingly ordinary people. Share this investigation with others who appreciate historical true crime, hit that like button to support our research into forgotten criminal cases, and don't forget to subscribe with notifications enabled so you never miss our deep dives into the disturbing chapters of American history that shaped our understanding of systematic evil. The financial evidence presented during the trial revealed that the family had accumulated over $60,000 through their criminal activities, representing wealth equivalent to millions of dollars in modern currency. Their systematic theft of victim assets had been conducted with the same methodical precision that characterized every aspect of their operation, with detailed inventories of stolen goods and careful laundering of criminal proceeds through legitimate business investments and real estate purchases throughout eastern Pennsylvania. The trial's most dramatic moment occurred when Prudence suffered a complete psychological breakdown on the witness stand while attempting to describe the family's victim selection procedures. Her hysterical confession provided additional details about their systematic approach to identifying vulnerable travelers and the psychological techniques they had used to manipulate guests before killing them, corroborating the evidence that had already been presented through physical discoveries and documentary analysis. The prosecution's closing arguments emphasized the unprecedented nature of the family's crimes and the systematic approach that had enabled them to continue their murderous operation for over a decade without detection. Mitchell argued that the Ravenswood family represented a new category of criminal organization that required severe punishment to deter similar systematic enterprises and provide justice for the 143 innocent victims whose lives had been destroyed through calculated greed and sadistic pleasure. The jury deliberated for only 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges against each family member, finding them responsible for systematic murder, robbery, conspiracy, and corruption of public officials. The overwhelming evidence had made their guilt undeniable, and the systematic nature of their crimes eliminated any possibility of arguing for reduced culpability based on temporary insanity or crime of passion defenses that might have applied to spontaneous violent acts. The sentencing phase of the Ravenswood trial began in November of 1893 with Judge Samuel Morrison announcing that the systematic nature of the family's crimes warranted the maximum penalties available under Pennsylvania law. The unprecedented scope of their murderous enterprise had shocked the legal community and created demands for justice that reflected both the enormous scale of their victims and the calculated cruelty that had characterized every aspect of their operation over more than a decade of systematic killing. Ezekiel Ravenswood received the death penalty for his role as the mastermind of the family's criminal enterprise, with Judge Morrison specifically citing his abuse of religious authority and his systematic corruption of family members as aggravating factors that warranted the ultimate punishment. The judge's sentencing statement emphasized that Ezekiel's twisted theological justifications for murder represented a particularly dangerous form of criminal sociopathy that posed an ongoing threat to society even during incarceration. Dr. Matthias Ravenswood also received the death penalty based on his role in developing the systematic killing procedures and his extensive documentation of torture experiments conducted on conscious victims. The prosecution had successfully argued that his medical training made his crimes particularly heinous, as he had violated fundamental ethical principles of his profession while using specialized knowledge to maximize victim suffering for his own sadistic pleasure and scientific curiosity. Constance Ravenswood received a life sentence without possibility of parole, with the court recognizing her crucial role in maintaining the detailed records that had enabled the family's operation to continue for over 12 years. Her meticulous documentation had provided investigators with comprehensive evidence of the family's crimes, but it also demonstrated her complete awareness of the systematic murder enterprise and her enthusiastic participation in every aspect of their criminal activities. Prudence Ravenswood received a sentence of 30 years in prison, with the court acknowledging her youth during the early years of the family's operation while recognizing her active participation in victim recruitment and evidence disposal. Her psychological breakdown during the trial had generated some sympathy from observers, but the systematic nature of her involvement in the family's crimes eliminated any possibility of arguing for significant sentence reduction based on diminished capacity or coercion. The broader investigation triggered by the Ravenswood case led to the prosecution of dozens of accomplices whose corruption had enabled the family's systematic murder operation to continue undetected for over a decade. Sheriff Douglas Whitman received a 10-year sentence for accepting bribes and deliberately obstructing missing person investigations, while telegraph operator Samuel Briggs and railroad conductor Martin Hayes each received 5-year sentences for their roles in directing victims toward the family's boarding house establishment. The financial investigation revealed the extent to which the family's accumulated wealth had been integrated into legitimate business operations throughout eastern Pennsylvania. Court-ordered asset forfeiture proceedings recovered over $40,000 in cash and property that could be traced directly to their criminal activities, though much of their stolen wealth had been successfully laundered through investments that made recovery impossible through legal procedures available during the 1890s. The systematic examination of the family's victim records led to the identification of most individuals who had been murdered during their 12-year operation, providing closure to families who had spent years searching for missing relatives. However, the investigation also revealed that the total number of victims likely exceeded the 143 confirmed cases, as earlier record-keeping had been less comprehensive and some evidence had been successfully destroyed during the family's desperate attempts to eliminate incriminating materials. The psychological evaluation of the family members conducted during their incarceration provided insights into the mental processes that had enabled ordinary individuals to participate in systematic murder without apparent emotional deterioration. Dr. Edward Harrison, who conducted extensive interviews with each family member, concluded that their crimes represented a unique form of collective sociopathy that had developed through gradual moral desensitization and mutual reinforcement of criminal behavior patterns. The impact of the Ravenswood case extended beyond criminal justice to influence broader social policies related to traveler safety and law enforcement coordination. Pennsylvania implemented new requirements for commercial lodging establishments, including mandatory guest registration procedures and regular inspections by state authorities. The case also highlighted the need for improved communication between local jurisdictions to identify patterns of criminal activity that might escape detection when individual cases were investigated in isolation. The media coverage of the trial and subsequent executions created national awareness of the potential for systematic family criminal enterprises that could operate undetected for extended periods in rural areas with limited law enforcement oversight. Newspaper accounts of the case were reprinted throughout the United States, serving as warnings to travelers about the importance of verifying the credentials and reputation of lodging establishments, particularly those offering unusually low rates or exceptional hospitality that might indicate ulterior motives. The execution of Ezekiel Ravenswood took place on March 15, 1894, exactly 1 year after the federal raid that had ended his family's murderous enterprise. His final statement continued to express no remorse for his crimes while maintaining that divine justice would vindicate his actions in the afterlife. The execution drew thousands of spectators who viewed his death as appropriate punishment for the systematic murder of innocent travelers who had sought nothing more than safe lodging during their journeys. Dr. Matthias Ravenswood was executed 2 weeks later on March 29, 1894, with his final statement consisting of clinical observations about the execution process that demonstrated his continued detachment from normal human emotional responses. His death eliminated the possibility that his twisted medical knowledge could be used to harm additional victims, though his detailed journals would continue to provide insights into criminal psychology for researchers studying systematic murder and torture methodologies. The broader criminal network that had supported the Ravenswood operation was systematically dismantled through prosecutions that extended well into 1895, as investigators traced financial connections and corrupt relationships throughout eastern Pennsylvania. The case demonstrated how extensive criminal enterprises could develop when systematic corruption compromised law enforcement oversight and created environments where organized crime could flourish without effective opposition from legitimate authorities. The aftermath of the Ravenswood case created lasting changes in American law enforcement and criminal justice that extended far beyond the immediate prosecutions and executions. The systematic nature of their crimes had revealed dangerous gaps in interjurisdictional communication and oversight that had allowed a family murder enterprise to operate undetected for over 12 years while claiming 143 innocent lives. Federal authorities implemented new protocols for tracking missing persons across state boundaries and established requirements for local officials to report suspicious patterns that might indicate organized criminal activity. The Ravenswood estate itself became a source of ongoing controversy as local authorities struggled with questions about how to handle property that had been the site of systematic murder and torture. The main house was eventually demolished in 1898, but not before becoming a macabre tourist attraction that drew thousands of visitors eager to see the basement facility where the family had conducted their systematic killing operation. The property was ultimately converted into a memorial cemetery where identified victims could be properly buried with dignity after years of desecration in the family's charnel house. Constance Ravenswood died in prison in 1911 after serving 18 years of her life sentence, maintaining her detailed record-keeping habits until the end while showing no apparent remorse for her role in the family's systematic murder enterprise. Her final writings, discovered after her death, revealed continued pride in the organizational efficiency that had made their criminal operation successful and expressed regret only that they had been discovered before achieving their goal of accumulating $100,000 in stolen wealth. Prudence Ravenswood was released from prison in 1923 after serving 30 years for her role in the family's crimes, emerging into a world that had changed dramatically since her incarceration. She lived quietly under an assumed name until her death in 1945, never speaking publicly about her experiences or expressing remorse for her participation in the systematic murder of innocent travelers. Her silence maintained the family's pattern of refusing to acknowledge the humanity of their victims or accept responsibility for the devastating impact of their crimes. The psychological research conducted on the Ravenswood family members during their incarceration contributed significantly to early understanding of criminal psychology and the development of systematic murder enterprises. Dr. Edward Harrison's extensive interviews and behavioral observations provided insights into how ordinary individuals could participate in systematic killing without apparent emotional deterioration, influencing criminal psychology research that continues to inform modern understanding of serial murder and organized criminal behavior patterns. The financial impact of the family's crimes extended beyond their immediate victims to affect entire communities whose economies depended on commercial travel along major routes. The revelation that a respected boarding house had been systematically murdering guests created widespread fear among travelers that took years to overcome, forcing legitimate establishments to implement additional security measures and verification procedures to restore public confidence in commercial lodging facilities throughout the region. The Ravenswood case became a foundational study in American criminology, with law enforcement agencies using their methods and organizational structure as examples of how systematic criminal enterprises could develop and operate undetected for extended periods. Police training programs incorporated lessons learned from the investigation into their curricula, emphasizing the importance of pattern recognition and interjurisdictional cooperation in identifying organized criminal activity before it could claim additional victims. The legal precedents established during the Ravenswood prosecutions influenced criminal law development throughout the United States, particularly regarding conspiracy charges and the prosecution of family criminal enterprises. The systematic nature of their operation required new approaches to evidence presentation and criminal liability that would prove valuable in subsequent cases involving organized crime and systematic murder operations that emerged during the early 20th century. The memorial services conducted for identified victims in 1899 provided closure for families who had spent years searching for missing relatives, though the ceremonies also highlighted the dozens of victims whose identities remained unknown despite extensive investigation efforts. These unknown victims were buried in a common grave with a monument listing their estimated ages and the dates when they had been murdered by the Ravenswood family, ensuring that their deaths would not be forgotten even without names to commemorate their individual lives. The broader social impact of the Ravenswood case influenced American attitudes toward rural hospitality and commercial travel, creating awareness that systematic criminal enterprises could hide behind facades of respectable business operations and religious respectability. The family's ability to maintain their reputation for Christian charity while conducting systematic murder demonstrated how dangerous individuals could manipulate social expectations and community trust to facilitate their criminal activities. What haunting lessons can we draw from this chilling chapter in American criminal history? The Ravenswood family's systematic approach to murder reminds us that evil can wear the mask of respectability and operate in plain sight of entire communities. Their crimes demonstrate how gradually eroding moral boundaries can transform ordinary people into monsters, and how systematic corruption can enable horrific crimes to continue undetected for years. Share your thoughts about this disturbing case in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell to join our community of truth seekers who refuse to let these dark chapters of history remain forgotten. The legacy of the Ravenswood family murders continues to influence modern criminal investigation techniques and victim advocacy efforts that ensure missing persons cases receive appropriate attention from law enforcement authorities. Their systematic approach to killing innocent travelers serves as a permanent reminder that vigilance against organized criminal activity requires constant cooperation between communities, law enforcement agencies, and citizens who recognize that protecting society from systematic predators demands collective responsibility and unwavering commitment to justice for all victims of criminal violence. The 143 victims of the Ravenswood family's systematic murder enterprise represent more than statistical casualties of organized crime. They were individuals with hopes, dreams, and families who loved them. Their tragic deaths at the hands of calculated killers who viewed them as nothing more than sources of profit and sadistic pleasure serve as permanent testimony to the importance of remembering that behind every crime statistic lies a human being whose life had value and whose death diminished our shared humanity.